Hi, Ms. Google here with Unit 1, Part 2. So we're going to continue on with ecosystems, and this time we're going to focus completely on all the biotic components. So one thing that we need to focus on is vocabulary. So one of the things that we look at are trophic levels. So remember from last time that trophic means feeding. So what level do they feed on? So last time we talked about photosynthesis and that it was producers that did that. So our producers, or another synonym for that, are autotrophs, are those organisms that will go through either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So in most ecosystems, those are going to be plants. Now, the producers or autotrophs are the ones that capture that inorganic energy and convert it into something that can be used by heterotrophs or consumers. So heterotrophs are those that cannot make their own food. Now we have different levels of consumers. You might see it referred to as primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers. So a primary consumer is one that eats producers. So a synonym for that might be an herbivore. A secondary consumer is one that eats a primary consumer. Now they might also eat plants. And so if they ate both a primary consumer, which is an animal, or and a producer, they would be considered omnivores. And a tertiary consumer eats secondary consumers. So you can see it just kind of works its way up, and we'll see some pictures of this in a second. Now our decomposers are those that take all of the leftover nutrients and convert it back into its organic form or its inorganic form. So it takes the nutrients from living things. Once they die, it breaks it down into its nutrient components so it can become part of the soil and be recycled. So decomposers can be either aerobic in the presence of oxygen or anaerobic in the absence of oxygen. Both will get the job done, but aerobic is much faster. Scavengers are those critters that are not hunters, but they are consumers, and so they go around and they eat the scraps, and they're actually quite an important component of our food chain. They kind of clean things up. And detritivores are very similar, but they'll eat partially decomposed plant material. So those are actually really key components of our soil because they'll go through and they'll start to eat up decomposed plant material within our soil. So that's things like earthworms. So here's just a visual representation of our different levels. So you have our producers up in that left-hand corner, so our trees or our diatoms. So just to let you know that they are either large majestic oaks, but actually most of our photosynthesis in our world is done by diatoms and by algae. So most of our algae that covers the top levels of our ocean, that's 75% of our planet, most of the photosynthesis in the world is actually done by algae, even though we often associate with trees. Our herbivores are our primary consumers, and just so you can start to get a sense of the scale, they can either be huge, like giraffes. Some of our largest animals ever on this planet are actually herbivores, but they can also be tiny, like little caterpillars. And our carnivores, here's a picture of some type of a sea hawk. But also don't forget that a lot of our insects are carnivores, and we'll get into that later in the year when we start to talk about maybe using them as pest control. And then our decomposers, you have our primary types of a mushroom and bacteria. So fungus and bacteria are our two primary types of decomposers. So one way to look at this is like in a food chain, how they all rely on each other. So starting down at the bottom are our primary producers or our autotrophs. So again, just getting used to using those synonyms. The primary producers are the ones that take the energy from the sun and convert it into something that's usable by animals. So our primary consumers are the ones that eat our producers. So the first name for a synonym for our primary consumers is an herbivore. A secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. Now remember, a secondary consumer can also eat a primary producer. And if that's the case, we call it an omnivore. Okay, so an herbivore eats plants, a carnivore eats animals, an omnivore eats both plants and animals. A tertiary consumer will eat a secondary consumer, And then our quaternary consumer, or our top predators, will eat the tertiary consumers. So you might have examples of all of these levels in an ecosystem, or you might only have a few. It's just being able to interpret a food chain in this case, or maybe a little bit better is to interpret a food web. So a food web is more the application that you'll have of this, say on your AP test, so that you can kind of pull out your own food chains within here. If we start with light right over here, and the light goes to our phytoplankton, and our phytoplankton go to our krill, and our krill go to our squid, and our squid goes to the sperm whale. So right within there you have a food chain. So being able to pull a food chain out of a diagram like this is an important skill, but also being able to to interpret a food web, because a food web gives you a lot more information than a food chain does. Like for instance, if you take a look at the krill right here, within that food chain that I pulled out from light to phytoplankton to krill to squid to whale, you didn't really quite see the importance of the krill. But if I take a look at this food web, I can see that krill is food for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 critters. Okay, so that krill is actually serving a really, really important role within that ecosystem. And if I were to pull that krill out of that ecosystem, you would have a lot of problems. And so a food web can really start to show you those complex interactions. Now, one thing that you might be thinking is, how did I know that the krill was the one doing the eating rather than the other way around? And that's also an important skill to know about how do you determine what is eating what, because that's what the food web tells us. It shows you who's eating what, but more importantly, it shows you where that energy is going. So we say it shows us the flow of energy, because here our food is energy. So I do have something that helps us to remember what the arrows mean, and that's an acronym, and our acronym is the class that you're in, and that's APES. Okay, so my acronym is that the arrows point to eaters. Eaters. Arrows point to eaters. Okay, also a little bit better is arrows point to energy, energy flow. Okay, so making sure you have arrows in the right direction, making sure you can read a food web, that's actually a really, really important skill in this class. So being able to pull out from this diagram where my primary producers are, where my primary consumers are, which ones are my tertiary consumers, which ones are specialists, which ones are generalists. So here, if I were to pick out a specialist, I might pick out a humpback whale because it only has one food source. Whereas I could pull out, say, the elephant seal. I see that squid goes to it as well as these pelagic fish. So that would be a little bit more of a generalist. One of our key generalists in here is a leopard seal. Take a look. He can eat Weddell seals. He can eat pelagic fish, penguins, king penguins, and squid, krill. So he eats a lot of different things. So this leopard seal might be in a little bit better of an advantage over, say, our humpback whale, that if something happens to that krill food source, that humpback whale is going to be in trouble. So there's just a lot of information you can get from looking at a food web. Now, another important thing that we take a look at with food chains is not only what eats what, but also about the energy that's flowing through. So energy is a key concept in this class. So sometimes we'll be talking about an energy that we use. Here we're talking about it energy from the sun that's transferred into energy to food. So the ultimate source of energy is the sun for most ecosystems. And plants only actually capture about 1 to 5% of that potential energy in the sun. And any predator out there, nobody is 100% efficient. Nobody just lays on their back and lets food fall into their mouth. And so actually eating and being a predator are very, very inefficient, to the tune of they lose about 90% of the potential energy they had. So we call this a rule. We call this the 10% rule, that for every step up the food chain, you actually lose 90% of energy. So only 10% of energy is transferred. So to put these in a couple of different terms here, that if you have a field of clover, and let's say you have 100 kilograms of clover, that 100 kilograms of clover will only support 10% by mass of its primary consumers. So 100 kilograms of clover will support about 10 kilograms of rabbits, and that will support about 1 kilogram of fox. So it goes kind of both ways with energy and biomass. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, where does that 90% go? So when we eat, we have food that goes in, and most of that energy is lost just for the process of living, cellular respiration, metabolism, movement. If you think about all our warm-blooded critters, it takes a lot of energy to keep our body temperature, the temperature that it is. It takes a lot of energy to move, to grow, for our cells to divide. So all of our metabolism, all of our body working stuff, that takes up a lot of energy that's not going to be available for the next level. Also, there's waste. We don't incorporate everything we eat into our tissues, so there's waste. So 10% of the energy by rule is about what's available to the next ecosystem level. So here's just another way of looking at it, two different ways here. That here I have our energy pyramid. So the last one we looked at was by mass, so the kilograms of clover to the kilograms of rabbit. And here we have it by energy. So here we're looking at the amount of joules of energy that's available in our producers in this ecosystem that can support 1,000 joules of energy in our primary consumers, and then up to our secondary consumers, 100 joules. So you lose 90%, so it's 10% transfer. And here, just another take a look at it, that our primary producers, from that 1 to 5% of the energy from the sun, only 10% is transferred up to our herbivores. And then from that 100% that the plants started with, only 1% is available to our secondary consumers. 0.1% is available to our next level. And then our apex predators is only 0.01% of energy. Now, this should also start to give you a sense of why our top predator populations tend to be very small. You can't have a jungle ecosystem and have a large number of lions. You can't have a large number of top predators in any given ecosystem because the energy availability is just not there. Another key thing that this starts to get at is when you take a look at our primary consumers, some of our largest animals ever on the planet, elephants, blue whales, even some of the dinosaurs, our largest animals tend to be herbivores because every step of the way energy is lost, biomass is lost. And so if you're going to be able to have enough food to support a large size, you need to eat lower on the food chain. So this is what we've been saying about our food chains and our different levels of our trophic levels and how energy moves through the ecosystem. So it just was a nice concise summary of what we learned about both in part 1 and part 2, and more in a couple other lessons that we'll be doing. So that ends our unit 1, and make sure you ask any kind of questions in class.